Hello, namaste. Welcome to Dave's Hammer Show. This is the flagship program of Indigenous television. Through this television show, I try to bring the voices of Indigenous peoples from across the globe and try to connect their struggles and successes with one another. Sometimes I conduct face-to-face interviews, sometimes I conduct online video conferences, and I try to analyze the issues affecting Indigenous peoples around the world. Today I have invited a guest. His name is Chris Mottes. He is Chief Executive Officer of Hindenburg Systems based in Copenhagen, Denmark. Basically, I'm going to talk about this Hindenburg Systems, which specializes on developing audio software for the radios and its involvement with indigenous peoples. First of all, welcome you to the show, and could you please introduce yourself and about Hindenburg Systems?
My name is Chris Mottes. I'm the CEO of Hindenburg Systems. We are based in Copenhagen. Basically, we are a small family-sized software company. We have 5 employees and 1 in the US. And we create software for recording and editing audio stories, basically radio, podcasts. We work globally, and a very central mission for Hindenburg is to support indigenous media and community radio around the world. So we basically try to make it either free or as cheap as possible for all organizations outside of the, let's call it the high income countries, to get them to pay so we can give it away to everyone else.
This means Hindenburg System is software development company, right?
Hindenburg is it's not that complicated. What we do is we create software for Mac and Windows to allow you to record and edit radio or podcasts. It's, as I say, it's a very small company, so we're independent. We don't have any external investors or anything, so everything we do is based on what we can earn. We work in areas, we also create products for audiobook creation, and work with a lots of talking book libraries for the blind around the world to allow them to create audiobooks that are easy for blind people to use to navigate with a special hardware system that is developed for talking books for the blind. We don't make those. It's just something we help them create the content for.
I see. I really liked your works. Basically, especially creating an audiobooks for blind. Could you also tell me your works in the sector of indigenous peoples?
We work with, we are particularly strongly associated or partnered with the organization called Cultural Survival. Initially, we tried to create direct partnerships. I mean, if you remember yourself, Dev, we connected, it must be 5 years ago, more 6, 7 years ago now, with when you were starting out with indigenous people, indigenous media. You were definitely not in TV at that point. You were still working with radio, and you were still building that up, as I remember it. And we partnered directly with you to support you with software and whatever else we could. I mean, we're a small company. We don't have a lot of money, but we try to help with all our other talents and knowledge and our software. And we did that with similar community radio stations in Africa, in Zambia, in South Africa. But as a small company, it's very difficult for us to uh, contact and be in contact with so many small indigenous media organizations. So a few years after we started working directly with the Nepali Indigenous Media Group, we contacted something called Cultural Survival, which I believe, Dev, you also work with, and created a partnership where they help us to identify and communicate with media groups, particularly community radio in our case, because that's what we specialize in, that are in need of our software and our help. Instead of both because of the simple fact that we're small, so we can't have that many. We're not very. We don't have the manpower to contact so many groups, and also because of language issues. Cultural Survival has a very strong presence in Central and South America, and our Spanish is very limited. In Nepal, of course, we have our contact to you, so I don't have to speak Nepali or any other local indigenous language. But so Cultural Survival has that competence and that network to allow us to work directly with them, and then they tell us, okay, these groups could use our help, and then we make a contribution to their work.
Great.
Every year, also on World Radio Day, which is the 13th of February, we do a special promotion of our software where we provide reduced prices that and whatever and a certain percentage of that from that day goes directly to Cultural Survival as our annual donation to the company, to the organization.
I also would like to thank Hindenburg Systems, especially at the initial phase of us starting indigenous community radios in Nepal. Hindenburg Systems and your team had provided technical supports. By the way, what is the reasons how come that Hindenburg System thought to support indigenous media, especially across the world?
The reason Hindenburg Systems is involved with supporting indigenous media is actually based on the history of the founders. Personally, I grew up in Southern Africa, in South Africa and Swaziland during the apartheid era, and I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement. And I had, because of my background, I grew up very close to the indigenous population in Swaziland and South Africa. I speak, or I used to speak, I'm an old man now, I used to speak Zulu and Siswati, and had a lot of friends, or the majority of my friends were indigenous to Swaziland and South Africa. And so for me, I don't know whether I have considered it to be a question of indigenous or not. It's just a question of people having the right to have their culture and to protect their culture. And in apartheid, of course, that was a very extreme situation where there was a dominant culture that was trying to basically destroy the other cultures. My partner, Nick, who was, I think we could call him the original founder of Hindenburg, he was working, he's a radio journalist and from the Danish Broadcasting Corporation, and he was working in Zambia in 2006, 7, 8, where he was involved in creating community radio stations in the rural area of Zambia. And so, again, from his perspective, the value of supporting media for local and or indigenous people was very present. I think that for us it was not so much necessarily about indigenous again contra not indigenous. It was more a question of local and community. Of course, those two things are very closely related in many instances. And very often we found that these local community stations were a way of providing a forum, a voice for disenfranchised local indigenous people. But the basis was for us local community media. And during the process of working in Zambia with these organizations to create community radio, Nick Dunkley, my partner, and Preben Fries, the other partner who founded Hindenburg, realized that there was a need for software to record and edit audio narrative, so radio, podcast, stories rather than music, that was easy to work with, that was made for the purpose, that could be used with people that don't necessarily have many years of school or high computer literacy, because all the software that existed at that time was created for music production and it was made for highly trained sound engineers. And so we set out to create software. Initially, the idea was more like just a project to support a community radio around the world, give it away for free, and have our day jobs on the side. But for different reasons, Nick had to move back to Denmark, and he realized that there was actually a market or a need for this kind of software all over the world, first world, third world, whatever you want to call it, developing, developed. So on the basis of that, started creating this as a business instead, with the aim of being able to support community radio around the world. And we have to make a living, so it's a balance all the time. We're trying to make sure that we create an income for ourselves and to sustain the company and the software in a way which is which creates ensures that the product is sustained well and to high quality. And so our general rule now is that in the developed world, commercial ventures pay full price, non-profit pay a lower price, and then in developing countries which can't afford any software fees, well, then we give it away as a sponsorship.
Hindenburg Systems, or your team, is trying to bring the voices of locals. UN this year is observing International Year of Indigenous Languages 2019. What is your views how a community radios can play a role to revitalize, preserve, promote indigenous languages?
In my view, a community radio is not a community radio unless it supports the community around it. So I would expect any community radio in any area to support or to provide airtime and resources to allow all language groups to broadcast. But of course, the problem is that a community radio station or a non-profit station is driven by the forces and the interests of the people who started. And you cannot force anyone to do anything if they're a volunteer already. So I would say that the most important thing is that for the indigenous groups to work with organizations like Cultural Survival or UNESCO, or in your case, Indigenous media groups, to form their own community radio stations or to partner with existing groups that also want to do it, depending on resources. Because there's always a balance. You cannot set a requirement for a group of volunteers who get together to let's say there are two language groups in the same area, and the one language group decides that they want to create a community radio station. You cannot force them to provide airtime to the other group, but you can work with them and partner them and work together to create that community radio station so that it's a partnership. And I think this is also one of the things that is frustrating for someone like me who comes from Africa, where tribalism is really strong, is that there is not necessarily the fact that two indigenous groups living next to each other want to support their language. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're good friends because of historical reasons. If you think about Denmark and Germany, for example, supposedly developed world countries, and yet there is still a rivalry, if you like, between the language of German and Danish, and the Danish and the German people. So that tribalism is throughout the world. So there's no magic formula for this, but it's important that people who do understand the value of sharing values and finding common meeting grounds, that community radio works in that way, that it is a place not for promoting one indigenous group or one language or one culture, but being a place where all cultures are represented. But that requires an effort from all parts. It's not something that you can say is a requirement. It's something that people have to do themselves, in my opinion. And we are there. And one of the basic tenets of the way we try to support is that it cannot be for groups that are trying to promote themselves over another group. It has to be about a group promoting themselves in conjunction with, or in parallel with, or in an open community radio forum. I think it's very dangerous to create media for particular groups, and this is not just a question of indigenous groups. This is political groups, and if you look at media in the United States today, it's very insular. Either you're Fox Radio or you're CBC Radio. You listen to the one political perspective or the other. So these things are all parallel, whether it be indigenous groups or political groups, or in Nepal you have also had, I know, a history of many strong political movements that also, like the rest of the world, not very good at sharing a forum and talking to each other. It becomes confrontational. And I have to say that even here in Denmark, we have to be careful not to be too good at telling everyone else what to do. In Denmark, there are indigenous, well, not indigenous groups, but small cultural groups that don't get airtime because of a dominant national culture. So, it's not as if these challenges are unique to developing countries. It's a global problem that has to be addressed. It's very common for people of European and North American backgrounds to point fingers at the developing world about how they are not supporting multiculturalism and so on, and yet in our backyard things are not much better. So how we tie that up to next year? Well, I think that community radio has a huge role to play particularly because it's the easiest way to create a forum for people of indigenous and cultural groups to talk to each other internally and talk to others and represent their culture and make sure that it continues. But it's also a dangerous forum for creating silo groups that don't open up and represent, allow cross-cultural discussion and commonality. So it's very challenging. I'm not sure there is a solution.
I also want to know how and when partnership between Hindenburg Systems and Cultural Survival, Boston-based organization in US, started to let the voices of indigenous peoples voice heard from around the world.
I don't remember how it started. I, I sometimes think of that. All of a sudden, one day we were talking to them. I suspect, if I remember correctly, it had something to do with our discussions. That when we were looking for ways of supporting in the Indigenous Media Foundation in Nepal, and you and I were discussing that somehow the cultural survival got into that conversation, but I cannot for the life of me remember why or how. So, and what also was pure coincidence was that Mark Camp, who works with cultural survival, by pure coincidence, has his wife is Danish, or I believe, and so he came to Denmark and we met. So you know, honestly, I've been trying to remember, and I cannot remember. So much goes on, but at some point we discovered that it was a good way for us to work. It was an advantage for us that they had so many connections, and we wanted to be able to get a much broader. We want to get into contact to a much broader group of indigenous media, and needed that kind of a portal, if you like, that cultural survival is because of their contacts. And so we proposed that we work with them rather than trying to work with individual groups around the world, and we'll continue to do so.
By the way, what is difference between your software and other audio editing software?
Has tried to do from the beginning is to create software that is designed particularly for use by journalists and storytellers, as opposed to the existing software on the market prior to that, which was made for musicians and for film production. And so, and those the other software on the market is also created primarily for sound engineers rather than storytellers. So this is kind of like a basic design principle which then guided our whole development, that it had to be easy to use and had to be made for, particularly for audio narrative. What that means in reality is that our interface is very easy to understand. It's visually created in a way where it's easy for people to understand what they're doing. It's created in a way where we automate a lot of the sound engineering that a journalist has to do manually. As an example, every time you import an audio file or record an audio file in Hindenburg, we analyze it and automatically set the levels to broadcast levels so that you don't get, because this is the manual task that a lot of journalists either don't know how to do or do very badly and spend a lot of time on it. And yet, because we use a system, a system called Loudness, which is a special algorithm, This allows us to make sure that all the audio you bring into Hindenburg is balanced. We also have features like on, if you look at our interface, you have a system for organizing your raw material so that it's easier to work with, which is particularly suited to if you have a lot of interviews and supporting material. You can organize it into these clipboards, as we call them, which allows a journalist to very easily have a clear overview of all the content that they have available in the product when they're going to create their story. And we have other features, noise reduction features and so on, which are also, a lot of these functions are available in all other software, but they're just not easy to use. And that's the important part, that it has to be easy to understand, easy to use, and simple to hear and see the results without being a sound engineer.
I also read that in your website, the Hindenburg software is being used by BBC and other well-known radio broadcasting companies.
Well, the Danish Broadcasting Corporation uses it, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC, a lot of public radio stations in the United States, including NPR, but a lot of the local public radio stations. We know that there are journalists working for the BBC and the German broadcasting companies and Deutsche Welle that use them, and we have, in some cases, it's a question of us having an official relationship with them, and in some cases, it's just the journalists buying our software and using it. So it's a balance, because we make our software available to both individual users and to radio stations. So both parties use that. And on the audiobook creation side, we work with the national and regional talking book libraries for the blind in Europe, Denmark, Norway, Holland, Belgium, and in the United States. A lot of both the Library of Congress and a lot of the state libraries use our audiobook creation software.
We have come to the end of our show. At last, I would like to request you to give one-line message to the world Indigenous podcasters. Chris?
I would say that whether or not you use Hindenburg is not important. What is important is that you work to allow indigenous and local communities to have a voice in the media. Hindenburg is just a way of doing that, but there are many ways to do that. The important part is the message and the access.
Thank you so much, Chris, for your time and esteemed thoughts you shared with me.
Very much for calling, Dev. I look forward to speaking to you again.
I have come to the end of the show. If you have any queries or feedbacks regarding this show, you can reach me at indigenoustelevision@gmail.com. Next week, I come with a new guest to discuss on new issues. Till then, have a nice weekend. Bye-bye.